Welcome to the first of two panels on the topic of new frontiers in space medicine. The moderator is Dr. Serena Aunon-Chancellor. Serena, as many of you know, is an astronaut, an engineer, medical doctor who's board certified in internal and aerospace medicine. She began working as a NASA flight surgeon in 2006, and in 2009 was selected as a member of the 20th NASA astronaut class. She flew in 2018 as flight engineer on ISS Expedition 5657. Serena has a number of research interests, including the medical implications of space radiation exposure. Her current duties cover medical issues and on-orbit support in the astronaut office. Serena, thank you for moderating this panel.
Well, good morning, Jeff. Thanks so much for the introduction, and good morning, almost good afternoon to everybody out there. Dobry večer. For those of you in Russia, so glad you could join us for this New Frontiers panel. If you hear barking or whining, that's my large dog to my left that you do not see in the screen. She wanted to take part in ISMS today as well. So I was excited to put this panel together. We have a wonderful set of speakers and two topics that we're focusing on because I just feel that they are so relevant to spacecraft operations today. The first being the challenges, certainly in the commercial spaceflight industry, of medically certifying spaceflight participants who have medical comorbidities or defects and the challenges associated with that. And then, of course, challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are nowhere near out of the pandemic. And the famous quote you have all heard is, "Those who cannot learn history are doomed to repeat it." And I will tell you, this will not be this planet's last pandemic. Folks, we still hearken back to the great flu pandemic of 1918 and tried to pull lessons learned in from there. But it's surprising how many things stay the same each pandemic we go through, and how a very small micron particle can bring everything to its knees in a second. So I wanted our panelists to also comment on how they have been able to keep spaceflight operations strong throughout the COVID-19 pandemic with continuous presence on orbit and even launching folks who have never launched before, not only into orbit, but low Earth orbit, and hopefully beyond someday. So with that, what I wanted to start with is a quick intro from each speaker. I'm going to let each speaker introduce themselves, just a few lines, because we definitely have a lot of topics to get through, and I want to make sure we leave time for questions, which I'll be monitoring in the chat box. Dr. Jennings, do you mind starting?
No problem. I'm Richard Jennings. I was a NASA flight surgeon and moved to UTMB. I've been involved with commercial space flight since around 2003, and that's what I'll be talking about today. This has been a remarkable year, as everyone knows, for commercial space flight. And we have a mission with Space Adventures where they should be leaving for Baikonur tomorrow, in fact, for a launch. And I've done a little bit of work with Virgin Galactic and quite a bit more with SpaceX, not so much with Axiom. And of course, Jim Vanderploeg and Smith Johnston are going to cover VG and Axiom, but very happy to be able to speak today.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Dr. Vanderploeg.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to join in this panel today. Relevant to the panel at the last piece of my 40 years in aerospace medicine and space medicine, I've served as the Chief Medical Officer for Virgin Galactic from 2006 to last year, 2020. I stayed on longer than anticipated before retirement to help deal with the COVID response for Virgin, and then retired. And now I have an ongoing consulting role as the senior medical advisor for Virgin Galactic, which means I get to do the fun stuff and not so much of the other stuff. I was able to help with the preparation for and the actual on-site support for the test flight that Richard Branson flew on in July of this year, and glad to be here and part of the group.
Thanks, Jim. Dr. Johnston from Axiom.
Good afternoon. Well, I'm in the same building I was in 30 years ago. I don't know if you can see this, but this was the view from my window, and there was no middle school, and you could see the Saturn V. So I haven't really gotten anywhere. I'm retired NASA in 2019. I was an operational flight surgeon, and started working for Axiom as the chief medical officer. Started consulting for them in 2019 because they were going to start to fly folks to the International Space Station. And then when I retired from NASA, December 2019, I came on full time. And I think there were about 21 people, and now we're at 374. And I did not know what I was getting myself into, but it's been really, really exciting and fun work. And now we're working to get our folks on our first mission in February 2020, and also build a space station. That's our job, is to build the next commercial space station, which will take over when the ISS is retired. And we're also building a spaceport down the street where we will house folks and have quarantine facilities and medical facilities. So we have a lot of parallel things to do to get things certified. And thanks to Richard and Jim and their team. They've done all the groundwork for this, and I'm just piggybacking and trying to squeeze in between KBR, SpaceX, NASA, and Axiom, get them all to work together. So COVID has been a challenge.
Wonderful. Thank you, Smith. Dr. Shah.
Hi, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Ronak Shah. I'm currently the medical director of clinical services at NASA's Johnston Space Center. In this capacity, I provide oversight of healthcare that we provide to the Astronaut Corps, as well as to that of the JSC workforce, both here locally in Houston, as well as overseas in Moscow and Star City. Prior to this role, which I've been doing for approximately 5 years now, I started off my career in the exploration medical capability element within NASA's Human Research Program. And then I transitioned slowly into a more operational role, providing support to our crew at the Neutral Buoyancy Lab and in Star City. So this is the New York bit, if you will, on my career at NASA in the past decade. And of note, I will be transitioning from this position to becoming the new director of the Aerospace Medicine Division in a few short months at University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. And that will take place early in 2022. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And finally, Dr. Reyes.
Good day. My name is David Reyes, and I joined NASA in 2014 after doing the aerospace medicine residency at UTMB. After that, when I joined NASA, I worked with exploration medical capability with Dr. Shah initially a while back, and worked a lot on their modeling, the integrated medical model, modeling medical events in spaceflight. And spent about a year of my life supporting operations in Russia, in Star City and Moscow, and supported the NBL quite a bit. That's the Neutral Buoyancy Lab where the astronauts train underwater for EVAs, extravehicular activities or spacewalks. And Dr. Shah tapped me to do the help run the COVID operations for the operational aspects of spaceflight, and here at JSC it's been about a year and a half or two, and that's it pretty much.
All right, thank you, David. I wanted folks to be able to hear everybody's background because they are all different, they're unique, but we've all worked together for many years, which is probably one of the coolest parts of this job. We interact all the time. So with that, we're going to roll into our first topic, which is medical certification of commercial spaceflight participants, especially those with comorbidities and other challenging conditions. And these topics I'm going to swing towards Dr. Jennings, Dr. Vanderploeg, and Dr. Johnston. And, I will say that in a really unprecedented, very short amount of time, we have seen tremendous activity and launching of people into space that maybe we never thought we'd see. Certainly Inspiration 4, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, And as Dr. Johnston mentioned, Axiom is planning for a flight very soon this upcoming year. And as Dr. Jennings mentioned, we've got 2 Japanese commercial spaceflight participants heading down to Baikonur tomorrow for a launch planned with Space Adventures on December 8th. So Dr. Jennings, if it's all right, we'll start with you. Just love to hear your experiences about some of the challenges of certification of these folks, especially the more recent ones we've had as operations proceed out in Russia.
Well, thank you very much, Serena. I'm really happy to talk. I made a decision a long time ago that I didn't care who had access to space, whether they were the right ones or the wrong ones, that I would do what I could to help people safely complete their missions and fly in space. And I've been able to do that now with Space Adventures since about 2003, starting with Greg Olson's mission. And I'll do mostly Space Adventures. I have worked on Dear Moon, Medical Selection, and Inspiration 4. And if somebody has questions on those, of course, I can't answer them. So, due to NDAs, but I have worked on those missions as well. I would like to thank George Abbey for this is a special year in commercial space flight. I would like to thank him for allowing us to put this commercial space flight portion of the International Space Medicine Summit. Space Adventures has been in this business, along with partnership with the Russians, since early 2000s with Dennis Tito's flight. They've done 8 missions now with 7 different individuals, and will be doing the 8th with their 9th and 10th space flight participants on December the 8th. One of the things that's interesting is that the Russians like backups, which I fully agree with. We've worked up about 25 different individuals for those particular missions. And it's fascinating that only 3 were born in the United States, that commercial spaceflight is truly international. Now, some, for example, Richard Garriott is from the United States, but he was actually born in the United Kingdom. And one of the other things that's very interesting and makes it somewhat challenging is that not everyone speaks English. Now, unfortunately, I don't speak English either. And so when I call New York, I have to have a translator. But trying to speak Russian and Japanese and putting that all together really makes it difficult. And you were mentioning COVID, that we spent quite a bit of time working up about 5 different people from other countries in the last 6 months. And the travel restrictions have caused us to have to use medical teams in other countries using units and things that we don't understand very well in the United States. All of it involves translation. There's risk when we fly people to UTMB. There's risk to us when they fly to UTMB. And it's made a major difficulty for this recent mission. So far, things are going real well, though, and I'm looking forward to a great mission. The testing that they have to undergo when they're going to go to the International Space Station is fairly extensive. You have Appendix F that the international partners have come up with. There's fairly rigorous standards for that. And we do a lot of testing. And, MRIs of the body, MRAs of the brain, angiography, CTs, CT of the heart, all kind of monitoring of the heart, a lot of optic work now with OCTs and retinal imaging, total body ultrasounds. And after working up these 25 individuals and also doing the work with SpaceX, I've come to the conclusion that there are no normal humans, that everyone has deficits or unusual things in some areas. And that's just the way it is. And when we start doing genomic screening, I think, to optimize the care and to individualize the care for the people that fly in space, which we must do, I think we're going to find other things there. And so the real issue becomes not is this person totally normal, but what were the risks that were identified? Are these risks that are acceptable, or do they need mitigating? And so mitigation might involve surgery, it might involve medications, it might involve increased crew training, It might involve flying additional things on orbit and testing that equipment and the downlinks and all the things that risk mitigation. And then finally, after you've done all that, you have to make a decision whether they fly or not. In the case with space adventures, I don't make that decision. That decision comes from the Russian medical team and the international partners because they have this huge investment in the International Space Station and their mission. And so the final decision rests with them. Unlike Inspiration 4 or unlike Dear Moon, where the final decision making is going to rest with the company. And so there's some really, and there's really no standards out there. Right now, the FAA does not require a certain standard for passengers, and this area is much more boggy than what we deal with the Russians and the international partners. I have to be fair to both the international partners, though, and the Russians, is they've done a great job, and we've had people with abnormalities. When we do a full assessment of the risk, they've been willing to accept some risk because these particular individuals aren't in a safety-related roles per se. They don't have mission critical assignments, and they've been very good at letting our spaceflight participants fly. Actually, my major concern, or my biggest concern, has nothing to do with a coronary artery calcium score that's slightly up or those sort of things. It's really that many times we're taking someone who, because of they may have been just picked because they had a certain medical condition in the past, or they may have been picked because they had a lot of money and just wanted to go do something. That sometimes the people who want to fly have had no experience in the at-risk world at all, no operational experience. And that, to me, is a little bit bigger concern. It's been wonderful at UTMB to have the psychologists and the psychiatrists who've been able to talk to these people and find out where their vulnerabilities are and how to best take care of them. But sometimes people who are billionaires, they kind of get what they want. They tell people in their company or whatever what they want, and they get it. They're not used to hearing the word no. They may not be a team player, for example. And certainly when we're doing commercial flights to the ISS, that individual must become a teammate on a crew. They must become a crew. And some people have difficulty doing that. And so this biobehavioral aspect of looking at people who've had no experience in the performance environment is my biggest concern. And again, can they handle stress? Whenever UTMB did the centrifuge work with people that wanted to do the centrifuge, they signed up to do the centrifuge, 14% couldn't do it. And they didn't complete the run or they didn't do the run. And so this isn't a minor issue. I do like, and I think the other companies need to use some aspects of the Russian approach, which I like. For example, the Russians do a rotating chair. Well, for me, it has nothing to do with neurovestibular. If I look at a rotating chair, I'm going to get sick. The question is, how does this person handle adversity? As their flight surgeon, I like to see what do they do after they're sick? How do they handle that? Same way with the altitude chamber. They go to 5,000 foot on air and 10,000 foot on a mask. Some people have never been locked in a chamber in their life. Some people have never worn a tight-fitting mask in their life. These are the kind of things that they may have to do in space, particularly, like say, if there's a fire in a capsule. I think these are behavioral tests more than medical tests. I don't think 100% oxygen at 10,000 meters is any issue, for hypoxia or whatever. They also do a lot of other things. I think the centrifuge comes into that. They do a GZ centrifuge up to 5 GZs. I think it's part of the medical certification, but that lets you know how they handle being strapped into a centrifuge. Can they follow orders? Can they communicate well when they're under stress? They do land survival or winter survival, water survival, integrated sims with emergencies. And I really like those sort of things. And whether you do those exactly things or NOLS type things for orbital flight, I think something like that's critical. Not so much for Jim's, short duration flight, but for orbital flight, when you're going to send somebody up to a really expensive facility with a very expensive mission, I think that's very, very important. I think the Russians' quote for that is, "It's nice to eat a lot of salt together." I think having meals with your crew members, doing sims with your crew members, doing activities with the crew members helps these individuals become a crew and helps them get over maybe some of their anxieties. That said, I think particularly when you're going to have 4 people like on Inspiration 4, or you can have Dear Moon with a lot of people who don't have a background in this, or you're starting to fly 2 individuals, which the Russians were going to be doing now twice this year. I do think you need backups. I think everyone needs the ability to be able to say, "No, thank you. I've decided I don't want to do that." And people need to have that option to back out. And so I do think, and the Russians usually require backup, and I think that is very appropriate. I don't know that SpaceX or other companies are going to do 6 months. I'm not sure what the right amount of time is, but analog activities that are stressful in team building, I think, are critical. One other thing I'll mention is that we need to do research. We need to do research on the ISS. I think that these commercial spaceflight participants are eventually going to be scientists. The other thing is they don't have a career interest. Astronauts want to do their next flight or the flight after that. They may be in the military. They have career interest and sometimes aren't as eager to be research subjects or to have their individual data published. I found that not to be true at all in commercial spaceflight participants. They really feel a need to help the ones that come after them be successful. And I think this has been very, very, very good aspect of commercial spaceflight. And I'll stop at that, Serena.
Thank you, Richard. That actually, I have about 4 questions, but I'm going to hold. So, because I want to make sure. Let's, Dr. Vanderploeg, if we could move to you and flights up into the suborbital region, would love to hear from you.
All right, thank you, Serena, and glad to be able to address some of the issues. I got into support with Virgin Galactic, kind of piggybacking on the shoulders of Richard Jennings and the work that he had done. And with over 10 years of working with Virgin Galactic's future astronauts, as they're called now, I came to completely change my approach and way of thinking about flying people with medical decrements and disabilities. I think our ability to safely fly individuals who have some type of medical issue or a physical disability is really only limited by our own lack of imagination and ingenuity in addressing those. Medical decrements like heart disease or hypertension or diabetes and so forth can actually be considered hidden disabilities rather than visible disabilities like paraplegia or blindness or deafness. And I view my job as a flight doc, and I think those of us working in commercial space similarly have the approach or the attitude that our job is figuring out how to say, yes, you can do this flight, rather than take the easy way out and just saying no, and you can't go. And so that's been a big part of what I've done, both in the research that Richard referred to, funded under the FAA Center of Excellence for Commercial Space Transportation, where we made extensive use of the NASTAR centrifuge to fly individuals with all kinds of medical problems, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, spine and neck problems, and so forth, and to evaluate and demonstrate whether or not we could do that safely in a G profile that was identical to the anticipated suborbital launch and reentry profile. And really, for the most part, the answer was, individuals with well understood, well controlled medical conditions can do this quite readily. More recently, I had the opportunity to work in with a project called Access. It's made a lot of news recently. This was a project in which we used the zero-G airplane to do a parabolic flight and selected individuals with 3 different categories of physical disabilities: blindness or deafness or mobility issues, everything from a full paraplegic to prostheses and things in between. And that experience, and we flew this about a month ago now, very successfully. But what I expected going in turned out to be the case, and that our prejudices and our biases about what people with disabilities can and cannot do are just that. They're biases against that. And what I learned in working with this project, working with people that are blind or deaf or have born with no legs and no arms, is that if you just explain what they need to do, what the goal is, and then just get out of the way, they'll figure it out. They'll figure out how to do it far better than I could or any of us with full use of our physical capabilities. And so it was again a part of the picture of saying, you know what, on the commercial world where we have opportunities and people interested to fly to space, be it suborbital or orbital, there are ways to safely do that, and it's just up to us to figure out how to make that happen. I know that NASA and ESA are taking the first small steps in exploring flying people with disabilities. I think what we'll see over the next decade is that private industry already is and will continue to be way ahead of government programs in opening up space to individuals who would otherwise be medically disqualified under government programs. And I'm really looking forward to the future in which people of virtually all kinds of abilities will be able to experience the wonders of spaceflight. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Serena.
Thank you, Jim. Again, I've got so many questions I want to ask, but I'm going to, again, pause, and we're going to move to Dr. Johnston from Axiom to hear his perspective.
Well, after those two folks talked, it's really hard to say anything else that really sums it up. It's risk. I think one of my mentors in med school, who I would go back and see, said, you know, the things that are really going to inspire you are things you're going to want to do in medicine, and the other things are the things that really upset you. I think he used the term piss you off. And so some of the things that really upset me was the lack of preventive care when I was being trained, and also the lack of hospice care. And I ended up, when I got to NASA, and basically these Jim and Richard mentored me there on standards, and I got so upset that we had these standards that no matter what, we knew they were wrong because it took them every so many years to change them, that they said, well, then fix it, you know. So I took on doing the standards. I guess fortunately, but I think unfortunately, they've morphed into these giant, you know, kind of things that we go by. And I think the only good thing of the last revision we did is we put a standard in, said that if anything, if medical evidence, evidence-based medicine proves this standard to be incorrect, you can trump it. And then we went for short duration space. For commercial space, we went, like Richard mentioned, Appendix F, which is a one-pager. But this pretty much encompasses on the scanning everything we talked about, which is if we scan people, we're going to find so many things, so many ditzels. I have one to deal with, this afternoon at an Air Med board. And anyway, so it's been a real challenge to help put this together. I thought I was a decent flight surgeon, and then when I got to Axiom, and I was an N of 1 or 2, and didn't realize all the support people behind me at NASA that were doing all the work. I really realized what a situation it really is to have a lot of folks and or not have a lot of folks. And you had to deal with not only the certification, which is very simple. We're going to the International Space Station. So all our folks have to be certified through NASA, like Richard did with Space Adventures through the Russian program. And then they had to go to the international partners. And it just so happens that we coincided with there being an astronaut selection. And even though we're going short duration, which should be something like this, we're actually putting our folks through something like this. And I get it. I understand why they're having to do that. And I think one of the big reasons is because of the visibility, the risk posture, with being the first commercial people to go to space station as a crew on their own vehicle, although Richard sent many, many folks there. And so it's been a challenge, and especially with COVID, because I signed up in I think we started in we got the port. We're building on the Node 2 port. We're building in the space station, which we'll take our first module up in 2024, and that's sort of the main mission for us. But we also every 6 months we're going to be flying, 4 people to the space station, and we're short duration missions. And soon to go long duration missions. And of course, with long duration missions, we need to do these standards, but I think we can get our risk way much better. And so, but we're doing this in a pandemic. So the communication, even though some studies will tell you that, in some instances, you can be 30% more productive on your computer, like we're doing right now. You can communicate with more people, but you can't. My first job was to get these folks certified, but now we have to build a space station, build a medical facility, build a research facility, and it has to pay for itself. It's barely being funded by government funds and by NASA, so it has to actually, sustain itself. All the things that we've talked about, that Liz Warren talked about, from as far as bioreproduction and better fiber optics and stem cells, we actually have to do that. And so like Lucas said, we need to let people know, and we need to simplify. We need to let people know we're here. And in fact, if we can get people in front of each other, which we're starting to do because the COVID problem is starting to get better, and we're starting to open up, and we're starting to get together. We're going to start to work these problems on in a better way, because everybody's overwhelmed. You heard about Artemis earlier today. You heard about SLS. NASA's overwhelmed with all they're having to do, and our person power capabilities is decreased by 3,000-4,000 people than what we used to have, and then all our other programs that are coming with SpaceX and with Axiom trying to go in there and go, we need to fly our folks. So that's been, in my usual rambling way, I think I'll segue to summarize. We've got to certify our folks. Like Jim and Richard said, we've got to get better on our risk analysis and fly more folks. And we've got to also start to communicate better face to face to help build all these different programs and work together with SpaceX, NASA, KBR, all our international partners. And finally, Axiom is going to be a standalone space station. And so the International Space Station will go away in 2028. And then we'll have to develop our own outside aeromedical board where people who want to go to the station will come through that board. And so hopefully over the next 10 years, 8 to 10 years, we'll develop that with this group and a lot of the younger folks who joined us. We now have a team of about 8 folks here in our medical facility. And we're excited to put it together. And I'm excited to let them do it and retire here soon. So it, and so that's a no. So thank you. And thanks for having us be here together.
Thank you, Smith. Much appreciated. So as you sort of heard Dr. Johnston allude to, everything has been more challenging with spaceflight operations during a global pandemic, which of course none of us predicted would be coming. On a personal note, I remember when the pandemic first hit and things began closing down and people asking me when I thought we might reopen, and I naively thought maybe just a few months later that same year, And here we are, almost at the end of 2021, and some parts of the US are going through another unprecedented surge, and of course Europe and Russia as well. So with that, I'm going to transition to our folks at Johnston Space Center. We're going to start with Dr. Shah, only because he and I were on the phone so much during the early part of the pandemic. I was put in charge of the response from the astronaut office, and I think we were on the phone for 2 to 4 hours a day, every day, trying to navigate our way and figure out what to do. And I would love for you all to hear his challenges and perceptions on what we did during the very early phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Shah.
Well, thank you. And I don't think there's enough time to go through all of this, but when Serena asked me to speak here today about the initial medical response to the pandemic that we had at Johnston Space Center, so I'm sure happy to. And then I spoke with some members of the team. I reviewed my notes, and I must admit that looking back was not fun. Looking back really resurrected a lot of rough emotions and feelings and tough times of working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. And it's worth noting that the first course of action that Johnston Space Center had was our director at the time, Director Mark Geyer. He established what was called the PIRG, the Pandemic Incident Response Group. And it was the purpose of this team was to ensure that we had an operational response at Johnston Space Center that ensured the protection of the workforce in a manner that would allow us to continue those critical tasks that just cannot stop, period, right? And so for me, when I think about it, the greatest areas of emphasis were both clinical and then communication. And so I could go down 2 different pathways. From the clinical standpoint, today we have guidance that is heavily evidence-based because we were able to synthesize the literature both domestically and internationally. And we're able to draw upon that. The CDC has some great guidance. And much of what we do is now driven by guidance, by frameworks of evidence-based medicine, multiple regimes of testing. Testing, as an aside, is available within minutes of anyone's home for most of us. And these are liberties that we just did not have. And so in the beginning, there was a core of 4 people that was comprised of me, our chief medical officer, and then our occupational and industrial health officers. And together we worked to disposition a lot of the clinical. Now, we're not primary care providers for anyone other than the astronaut corps. However, this is where the communication piece comes in, is we had hundreds of people across campus who were just, the pandemic disrupted their status quo. The clinic phone lines were flooded with people asking questions, some seeking medical guidance, some not sure what to do. So one of our earliest courses of action was to set up a clinic email hotline that was monitored effectively 24/7. And we were able to disposition simple questions versus people who needed other guidance. And it came down to spending hours upon hours late into the night talking to people and guiding them the best way possible. So from that standpoint, communication with people, and this is a message that I reinforced over and over and over again to our team, was you may not be serving as a physician, but in the capacity of listening, you still are providing that support for wellness, which is something that we need to be patient about to provide to our workforce so that they feel safe and reassured that we are doing our best to create a safe work environment for them. So once that team was formed early on, we recognized very quickly that we needed a centralized means to handle cases. So a campus-wide hotline was created where all calls could be routed from supervisors, and the supervisors would talk to these individuals, get guidance, and we would then notify whether it's occupational health and center operations, medical, what have you, if contact tracing was needed, if cleanup was needed. All of this can be done through a centralized hub. But again, getting to that point took time to figure out the best path forward. One of the other components that was very unique for us was determining how to best support operations. The greatest strategy for us was to reduce exposure to risk. So the number of people on our campus was reduced significantly, meaning there are other private industries out there that chose to pursue 100% telework. They chose to incorporate testing of all of their personnel. These are things that we did not pursue, but instead we reduced the presence of our workforce on campus to meet the minimum need to ensure critical operations were met. But nonetheless, there are so many different touch points for crew training, launch and landing operations that just had to continue. So a lot of this was not knowing what we didn't know. So when Serena makes reference to the fact that we're on the phone, it's because there's so many different areas that had to be addressed that some folks may just not know about. And so to centralize this, we realized that our core team of 4 just couldn't handle it. So it was initiated with something called the COVID Physicians Working Group, a group of handpicked individuals, about 5 or 6 of us, physicians, with a multidisciplinary background, both educationally as well as practically on the job. So we did not choose 5 operational flight surgeons or 5 clinic physicians. We chose 1 from each arena. We chose that the doctor who was in Russia was involved, our lab staff, a member from the crew office who's a liaison to flight medicine. So it was multidisciplinary, and we leveraged all of the knowledge that we had as physicians to synthesize the literature out there, local happenings, what do you know about local hospital resources, building those connections. I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge Dr. Phil Kaiser, who is the Galveston County Health Authority, also an infectious disease specialist who helped us tremendously in navigating matters very, very early on. And so by putting together the CPWG, we were able to augment the capabilities of our center's response. And now the CPWG forms a crux of being an intermediary through dozens and dozens of different stakeholders through center management. And I'm happy to announce that one of the things we're able to do is bring Dr. David Reyes on to help shepherd that effort. And he's really good at the helm and interfacing with all of our stakeholders and ensuring smooth operations. So with that, I'll pass on to Dr. Reyes to speak for a moment.
Yes, Dr. Reyes, so from the COVID czar currently at NASA Johnson Space Center, can't wait to hear where we are now and some of the challenges that you think we are facing right now at this phase in the COVID pandemic.
All right. So yeah, there's so many possible topics. So I sort of picked a few out. Our goal was more operational, or my goal, protect assigned crew, NASA personnel, and the mission. And so a big part of that was establishing an operational structure, which included the CPWG, COVID Physicians Working Group, which was really integral in weighing the literature and making recommendations. We were really clear that we don't make policy because that's a managerial role. We made recommendations to managers, and they adopted our recommendations, literally almost all the time. Occasionally they deviated, but most of the time they accepted what we suggested to them. And there was the, Dr. Shah mentioned the PIRG, the Pandemic Incident Response Group, and there was a pre-PIRG, which was more of the clinic folk and the occupational medicine. So we would talk about topics and then pass that on to the PIRG. Of course, most of our agenda was set by the OCHMA, which is the top NASA doctor in Washington, D.C. That's J.D. Polk, who would set broad policy, and it would come down to the centers, and then it was up to the PIRG to apply that policy locally, given our local strengths and capabilities or lack of thereof. So we had a few other important meetings that we established. One was a logistics tag, and that currently involves the people who order the testing and schedule the testing, people that do things like online health surveys and attestations and keep track of vaccination status in the operational setting, and our aviation operations directorate, and I'll talk about them in a second. There's another important meeting that we had that we established was the ISS PMO. That's I can't remember what PMO stands for. It's a primary medical officer, something like that. The doctor that's in charge of the medical aspects of the ISS overall, and currently that's Dr. Shearing. And also the commercial crew, the head of the commercial crew PMO, which is Dr. Tarver. So we would meet regularly, and come launch and landing time, we would have the crew surgeons for the current increment would also attend. And we talk about issues related to launch and landing. That's very important. And there was another group. There's a pre-existing scheme called a health stabilization program. That's basically to prevent diseases from getting, or infectious disease from getting to the space station, especially COVID at the current time. And so we also established something called the PFCC, which is post-flight COVID countermeasures. And we draft a memo in this team, the ISS PMO ops tag, COVID ops tag, and we draft an official memo that gets signed by the director of the medical directorate at JSC, and that's official policy that governs post-flight landing COVID mitigation. So that was super important. And it's interesting. I started around DM2, and since then we've had Crew 1, Crew 2, and now Crew 3. And also there was at least one or two Russian missions that launched and came back in that time period. And so this was a pretty interesting challenge. The first couple of times it was quite a challenge to coordinate all that, and then it's gotten easier and easier as everyone gets used to doing the work. I like to say it's by the time the pandemic's over, we'll have it perfected. And but we definitely need to record what we've done for the future, because there probably will be other pandemics, most assuredly. So another important thing was supporting the team. So the logistics team was where the rubber hit the road, and they were getting bombarded all the time by questions and people wanting them to do this and that. And so part of my job was to sort of take some of the pressure off of them and answer people's questions and direct people to appropriate resources. So I did a lot of that, especially early on. Pointing people to this official center guidance, like what do you do and if this happens or that happens, and directing them to those resources. And we also, another interesting point or important point is we handled crew a little differently, because they have specific operational constraints. We want to make sure that if they're exposed or whatever, like to a close contact, we want to make sure that they're not infectious and that they can still participate in their training. So that was a big part of what we did. We talked a lot about cases like that at the CPWG, as well as many other different cases and policy matters. So supporting the team, keeping the pressure off of them, supporting time off. So that's one thing. When the team members took time off, I really wanted to make sure that they were off. They didn't have to deal with anything, and encourage them to do that. And I wish I had probably done that a little more for myself, because it's been quite the grind, as you all know. Last sort of example, involving stakeholders early. So we had, because of all the launch and landing, we had the aviation operations director at NASA has a couple of Gulfstream aircraft, and they were shuttling crews that were close to launch, shuttling them to training events so that they wouldn't have to fly commercial, so that their risk would be reduced. And so we were making recommendations and policy that have impacted the Aviation Operations Directorate, and their schedule's very tight, as you can imagine. They only have so many people, and they're highly tasked. So they were a little upset at first at being basically not having input into the process. And so we folded them into the process. We had them come to our meetings and participate. And it was an amazing transformation, because by the end of it, they were setting the standard. So we would say, here's what we have to do. And they'd say, oh, why do we do this instead? And their ideas were often better. And for instance, this last launch and landing cycle, we test people before they board NASA aircraft. And we would test the aircrew at the same time. But so they said, well, why don't we just test everybody? Which actually was something we had proposed early on. They said, why don't we just test everybody, so that way we can substitute people in and out for these flights, because their schedules are so constrained. And so we said, that's a great idea. And so we did that, and everybody was super happy about that, because it reduced the burden on them. So I guess the moral of that is it involves stakeholders, and there's always room for improvement. And we have a really robust process in place now, and I think we're doing overall pretty well. Knock on wood. So that's about it.
David, thank you. I think it kind of highlights the fact that I know we've been in this for a long time, and people are tired, and it's almost been a couple years, but we cannot forget to go back and do a debrief of those early days and the response and what worked and what didn't work. Because like I said, history will repeat itself at some point. We've got to figure out a way to get multiple groups together so that we're better prepared. Certainly our capabilities have improved since the 1918 flu pandemic. And so hopefully by the time the next pandemic rolls around, we'll be even better prepared. I did want to give a chance for either Dr. Jennings or Dr. Vanderploeg to comment on just specific challenges with COVID. And from there, we can roll in, because we're already getting questions from the audience.
I'll go ahead, Serena. Just a couple of things from the private sector point of view. Virgin Galactic has two campuses. One in Mojave, where spaceship is being built and maintained, and one in New Mexico, where flights are occurring. So both of those, and so you have California and New Mexico, and the state experience with COVID and the rates of exposure and so forth. So it was a very challenging time. Pretty well shut down the workforce, except for a number of weeks, only security personnel and such at the two sites to maintain security, and worked our way through the science. As we learned more, we could fine-tune the response. Initially it was, you can't get enough tests, you can't get people tested, and you can't get masks and so forth. So just as everyone had to do, we had to work our way through what we knew, what we didn't know, and yet try and keep a business going. A number of the engineers pivoted to start making ventilators and oxygen hoods and other PPE, and worked in that arena. So segue to the flight in July with flying Richard Branson and Beth and Sarisha and Colin, and having celebrities and VIPs come in from overseas. So the protocol surrounding that flight was, if you're going to be in the main terminal, the first floor there is called Gaia. You either had to be fully vaccinated or you had to be 100% KN95 mask wearing to be there. Tested a number of people. We have the ability to do on-site PCR testing, And so a number of individuals we tested so they could leave because they had to have a test to be able to fly back to their countries and get back into their countries. So COVID response was a huge impact on company operations for months and months and months, and including being able to actually pull off the flight in July with hundreds of support personnel brought in for the media events and so forth. So yeah, it's lots of lessons learned. Hope we don't have to do it again in my lifetime, but we might. And I'll stop with that.
Thanks, Jim. I will say often, at least from the agency, we did look to our commercial partners and sort of what the industry standard was for everything from testing, just to see what else was out there. You know, how were folks running operations? What was their expectation? Certainly to help provide an asset to our resources, but also to say, you know, how aggressive are we being with testing? Could we improve how we were doing things? So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Jennings, did you have anything to add?
Just one short word, more of a personal story, but you know, my age, I'm some risk to travel and fly on airplanes to go through terminals and to go to Russia where there's a pretty high rate of COVID. And I'm totally data driven. If you ask me what's standing out in that field, I'll say on this side, it's a brown cow, but I won't tell you what's on the other side till I see it. Well, I'm real data driven. And I looked at the Israel data that they were coming up with regard to boosters. And they were showing, you know, pretty big drop off, and particularly Pfizer vaccine. And they were suggesting the booster, and we're giving the booster, and the data looked real good for the booster. So I had a decision to make, but the US hadn't approved the booster yet. So I just lied. Plain and simple. I said I had immune compromise and went in and got my booster and went to Russia. And I just think sometimes to do operations, you've got to do whatever it takes to support the mission and get the job done, but always within the data.
Wonderful, thank you. So we already have a question in the chat box, and Dr. Jennings, this is probably going to be thrown to you because it deals with the client that you already had through Space Adventures, Daisuke Inamoto. But the two questions kind of lumped together specifically are, we'll start with the first one. If you have had kidney stones, can you be flown in space? And this is from George Abbey Jr. And they're referencing the case of Daisuke Inamoto and that he was medically disqualified from flying. So we'll start with that one. If you have had kidney stones, can you fly into space?
Well, I think the answer is yes. To give you an example, one of the big troubles with kidney stones is pain and obstruction, two of the big things with it. And if a stone is in a place where it's not likely to be freed and it's under 4 millimeters, it's very likely to cause some discomfort, and we have medicine to treat that, and it's not likely to obstruct. If they get real big, then they're not likely to pass as well. So it always depends on the situation. It also depends on compliance with treatment and a lot of other things. But in general, someone who say they've had a kidney stone and they're totally stone free now, we're going to have them stay hydrated. We may give them potassium citrate. We may do a lot of things to mitigate risk, but they're going to fly.
Thank you. And that hits the second part of the question, which was, you know, has the US or Russia ever done kidney space research to look at countermeasures? And as you mentioned, we've looked at potassium citrate and hydration. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Dr. Pack, I think that's the name, P-A-K, and did extensive work during the shuttle program. Most people probably forget that now. But the one thing that we showed is that, interestingly, some people have high risk profiles on their 24-hour urines, and some people have normal profiles. All it takes to make a normal person have a kidney stone is to dehydrate them. And someone who's got a high risk profile, if they stay hydrated, they become low risk. So one of the nice things about knowing your level of risk is to intervene with some type of risk mitigation strategy. There's no doubt that the best thing you can do to avoid risk is drink more fluids. On the other hand, there's a lot of overhead, as you know, in space with drinking fluid and going to the WCS or wearing the diaper. And so some people, like all pilots, tend to dehydrate. But overall, knowing that someone is at risk is a plus, because you can do things like potassium citrate, like hydration, that reduce their risk back to the normal population.
Wonderful, thank you. So one question it looks like Dr. Reyes has his hand up. Dr. Reyes.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. So one of the other things that I do is help run the ultrasound screening program of crew. And we scan all the astronauts at least yearly, and then pre-flight and post-flight. And so I guess what I would just add is that screening is a huge component. So if somebody is periodically screened, and they have that, reduces the risk, or risk to the mission at least, and to them most likely. So that's an important part of it. That was it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So one question I had for Doctors Jennings, Johnston, and Vanderploeg, and I will not claim credit for this. This is something Dr. Shah and I talked about, was what do you think about flying a pediatric population on a commercial space flight as a spaceflight participant? Is that something you could definitely foresee in the next 10 years? Is, maybe not a 5-year-old, but a 14-year-old, someone under the age of 18? And how do we prepare for that? Who would like to tackle that one?
Well, I'll jump in first from the suborbital flight point of view. So two things. One is we first have to get past the current understanding of the regulations, which requires informed consent, and that you need to be at least 18 years old in order to sign your informed consent. However, if you look at medical informed consent as a model, parents sign informed consent to have their child have their appendix out or their tonsils out or other things done all the time. So why could a parent not sign informed consent for a child to do a space flight? That's a policy issue and a legal issue that I don't pretend to have an answer to. From the medical point of view, though, I think certainly for suborbital flights, I think it's very doable to safely fly a child of, we'll have to define what that age is. The flights are short. The risks are pretty low and pretty well understood. And so I would anticipate that if the legal issues get worked out on informed consent, we will see children flying on suborbital flights in the not too distant future.
Richard,
I would totally agree with that. In fact, I've been on a roller coaster at the Houston Rodeo with one of my kids, and I thought I was going to die. I mean, I was more worried about that roller coaster and my kid and myself than I would for these suborbital rides. Long duration is a whole other bailiwick. That's another ballgame.
Serena, I think it's going to be a little bit different for Jim's type flights, but when you're as old as I am, and I've been a pilot for 50 years and around the space program for a long, long time, and this isn't that safe yet. That's a lot of horsepower. That's a lot of speed, and that's a difficult entry. And we've lost 3 crews in the United States. The Russians have lost 2 crews in space. They've had some aborts with some serious injuries. And the truth is, for orbital type flight, I don't think we're there for flying people under 18 years of age. This is still, Story Musgrave, people ask Story, Story, did he like launching in the shuttle? And he said, no. He said he enjoyed the shuttle after the first 8.5 minutes were over because he knew all the things that could happen. And so do we. If you've been around flying or space, you've been to a lot of funerals, you've seen a lot of missing man formations. And I think it's too early to be flying people who can't get informed consent in orbital flight.
I would agree with you, Richard. So we have another question in the chat box for everybody, and it revolves around latent virus reactivation, which we have seen on both, evidence of both on shuttle and long duration space flights. And the question is whether the US or Russia has started developing spaceflight countermeasures to prevent various viral reactivations. This is open to the whole panel, whoever would like to tackle that.
Well,
The question is, I'm looking at the question. The question is whether the US or Russia started developing spaceflight countermeasures to prevent various viral reactivations. I think where we are right now in the stage of our fight against SARS-CoV-2 is more amongst what we can do terrestrially, right? So a lot of what we do is reducing risk by prevention. So having a very robust pre-flight regimen, the health stabilization program that we have. There are many individuals, for example, let's get a little bit more specific. Well, what does that mean? Pre-flight quarantine, we're much more vigilant on different components of that. We think about pre-flight exposure to different personnel who must be exposed to the crew, whether it's for the purpose of operations or research. And so we're very robust in screening these individuals. I think folks are well aware of the federal mandates for vaccination of federal employees and the contractors. So all of these things I just mentioned are meant to reduce risk from a more preventive standpoint. From the standpoint of countermeasures, however, right now, treatment capabilities on the ISS are still the same as before. So I think right now where we're focusing on is, like I said, in the pre-flight period, as well as in the post-flight period when we know that their immune systems are slightly depressed, again, trying to provide a more robust environment to protect the crew.
I would just take it to another level as far as reactivation of chronic viruses that we all have that reactivate. There was a microbiologist that spoke at Grand Rounds about 10 years ago that said for every outbreak on the skin, there's probably 5 times as many outbreaks neurologically or vascularly in your body. And so the question is, would we fly people on low dose antivirals? And we've discussed that with some of our folks pre-COVID. So I throw that out there. And then I've got to get off because I've got an Air Med board coming up here. And just a quick last couple of comments. I mentioned the thing about hospice because I'd like to fly somebody eventually who would go to hospice. To answer the final COVID question, mandating our folks to get, when we were 34 folks, we had, a kind of exposure and we had to shut down for 2 weeks. And we could do that when we were small, and it was a great lesson learned for us. And then we decided to mandate vaccination. So we're up to 6%. Only 6% of our population is not of our 374 are not vaccinated, and they're wearing masks. So when you reach that kind of herd immunity, like we do with our astronauts for COVID, you feel pretty confident with any virus. And let's not forget, we've had some sort of medical issue, and I don't know what it is, but come up that delayed a recent flight. So saying all that, I'll exit stage right and say how much fun it's been to be part of this group, and thank Mr. Abbey, and thank the Baker Institute. And David, are you going to go to the AirMed board?
Me, I think I will be there pretty soon.
Good, thanks. Okay,
Wonderful.
on that.
Thank you, Smith. Much appreciated. And I think we are almost out of time. We have time for one last question, which popped up in the chat. This is from Nicholas Tan, second-year medical student at Texas A&M, and was wondering if you, this might be a long question, Nicholas, but we'll try, how y'all got into aerospace medicine, and what advice would you have for students thinking about pursuing a career in aerospace medicine? And, and to add to that, would you do a more conventional residency first, such as internal medicine or family medicine first, before applying to do aerospace medicine? And that's, he apologized for the number of questions. That's okay. That's why we're here. Dr. Jennings, I am going to toss this one over to you to start, sir.
Well, I think we probably ought to communicate offline, to be honest with you. You know, I don't know why some people get measles and other people don't. But I caught aerospace medicine when I was in junior high school, and wanted to do this from the time I was in junior high school. So it's a little bit hard to relate to other folks. And luckily in college, they let me write instead of writing about symbolism and Beowulf, they let me write about the medical aspects of the space program. And so the most important thing is for young people and students is to get in the Aerospace Medical Association, get in the student and resident organization, go to meetings like this one, go to the Aerospace Medical Association meeting, get mentors, do rotations at NASA, do the short course at UTMB. There's become a pilot. There's lots of things you can do, but it'd be better if we communicate offline. Both Jim and I can give more information on this than he would want, or he or she would want.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And just to answer the second question, also, all of us that you see on this panel have done a primary residency prior to starting our aerospace medicine residency. So whether it's internal medicine,
that's even more critical, Serena, as we start taking care of people on long duration flights that are going to get illnesses, or as we have older and younger people flying, with the prevalence of illnesses in that group getting greater and greater. The ability to have a clinical skill in addition to the specialized things you get in aerospace medicine, I think is going to be critical.
Absolutely.
I could add one quick thing before we close here. A lot of the students who I've spoken to that have an interest in aerospace medicine have asked me, which field of medicine should I go into to boost my chances of getting into aerospace medicine? And that is not the way to look at it. Pursue what you are passionate about. If you like internal medicine, pursue it. If you like emergency medicine, pursue it. If you take a moment and look at the composition of clinical skills that exist, and I can speak specifically for NASA, if you look at the composition of the physicians that work there, it would be unsuccessful if we had 100% internists or 100% emergency medicine physicians. And the reason for that is that different skill sets are needed at different phases of flight. We reduce medical risk by preventive medicine in the pre-flight period. That's one of the hallmarks of being a preventive medicine field. When you go into the in-flight phase, you deal with a fair amount of primary care issues. That's your family medicine, your internal medicine. When you come back post-flight, you're dealing with a fair amount of rehabilitation. So you're starting to get the flavor here. Then you add in the launches, the landing, the contingencies, those emergencies. You need emergency medicine. You need all different skill sets on your medical team for everyone as a whole to be successful. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we close. So thank you, Serena.
Absolutely. No, thank you. That was great. And you can see in the chat from Danny Carroll. Hi, Danny. If you're also interested in surgery, there are space surgery associations. So it's really open to everything. Once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking part. This has been fantastic. Great questions from the audience. Thank you again to the Baker Institute, Mr. Abbey, Dr. Sutton, thank you again so much for the introduction, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Serena, thank you, and thank all the panelists. It's a great panel.